name is Emma Merrigan, and I use she, her pronouns. This is the fourth part of the series Accessible Affinity Programming, created by the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at Washington University in St. Louis. The next element to consider for publicity materials is the imagery you use to emphasize your program's theme. This process is also pretty nuanced, but we've included a few pointers to keep in mind. Firstly, if your graphics have images of people in them, consider including people with visible disabilities, especially of folks who are multiply marginalized. Often, media portrayals of disabled people are very white and heteronormative, and thus inaccurate because they exclude or minimize representations of other communities that commonly experience disability. Of course, it's important to avoid tokenizing disabled folks as well as other marginalized communities as well. So think about how you might incorporate imagery of multiple underrepresented disabled communities. You can and should be creative in how you represent different disabilities as well. Invisible disabilities, for instance, can be made more visible with things like sign language, mobility devices or prosthetics, and/or assistive technology. The goal here is, of course, not to include every type of disability or lived experience. Rather, your graphics can and should signpost very clearly to disabled folks that they are welcome at your affinity program, whether or not it specifically relates to disability per se. Another element to consider when selecting images for your program graphics is what message they convey about disability. In part 2 of this series on program design, we discuss some examples of stigmatizing or ableist language that might discourage folks from attending or engaging in affinity programs. The same can happen with imagery if it implies that disability is a universal tragedy, defect, or otherwise an unlivable form of existence. To combat these common ableist stereotypes, try to seek out images of disabled pride, community, joy, and even resilience. If you don't know the associations or history of a particular image, it's not a bad idea to do some research. The puzzle pieces symbol for autism, for example, carries negative associations due to its ties to Autism Speaks, an organization that has historically donated resources and advocated for erasure or elimination of autism, and in many ways still does. This is just one example of imagery that perpetuates the medical model rather than the social model of disability. To find out more about the distinction between these two models, refer to the CDI's Disability Justice Study Guide included in this video's description. As you have probably intuited by now, imagery for publicity materials is not always accessible by virtue of its being visual in nature, and therefore inaccessible to folks with vision-related disabilities. Therefore, you should always include an alternative description, also known as an alt text, of any images in your program communications, or of the graphics themselves, such as a flyer in the body of an email blast. An alt text description generally appears linked to or immediately below an image and includes any relevant information that participants need to know to understand your message and program details. Alternatively, some programs allow you to add alt text directly to the image by left-clicking on it. For instance, an alt text description of an event flyer would include details about the imagery in the flyer, background and foreground colors, and any written text included in your graphic. If you include the text in the body of an email or social media caption, however, you don't need to repeat it in the alt text description. Take this flyer for a freshman orientation as an example, where the alt text lists the background and foreground colors, information about the decorative spheres in the background, and all of the flyer's written text. If you'd like to listen to our alt text description, you can pause the video now and click on the link in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you have an image without words in an email or post, your alt text should describe what's depicted there as accurately as you can. If the image contains people, be careful not to make assumptions about their race or ethnicity, gender, sexuality, or disability. If the person's identity is crucial, however, you can use more descriptive language like a light-skinned person using a cane. In the example on this slide, we've limited the text to the action shown in the picture. A person reading Braille from a book laying open on a table. The image shows only their hands from the wrists downward. As you may have noticed from the alt text description boxes on screen, some programs can generate alt texts for images automatically, but always double check them to make sure that they are accurate. The automatically generated text for this image reads, "Hands holding a white book," which is inaccurate and incomplete information. Finally, on the topic of alt text, some resources mention designations for decorative images and alt text fields. In the video description, we've included a resource with some tips on deciding if your image is decorative, but when in doubt, always include an alt text. We've also provided some additional resources for writing effective alt text that you can read on your own. If you'd like to pause the video now, you can explore these resources before we move on to a short activity on writing alt text. All right, now that we've given you some basic information about alt text descriptions, let's practice with a couple of examples. On screen, we've included two images, one with and one without text. At this point, you can pause the video and take a few minutes to write a sample alt text for each one that you might use in an email blast, social media post, or an event web page. Once you've done that, proceed with the video so that you can compare your examples with ours. All right, let's take a look at the first alt text description. We've also linked it on screen now in the upper right-hand corner so that you can listen to it if you use a screen reader. Feel free to pause the video here and open and listen to our description. In our alt text, we've included information about background and text colors, some imagery, and all the text included. You may have also included references to the graphics of popcorn, a folded blanket, candles, and a play button, but we didn't incorporate them here since they aren't necessary to understand the graphic. Notice that we also included a description of the film graphic since it was included in the poster. This alt text is noticeably longer than most, considering the complexity of the graphic itself. So how does your alt text compare to ours? Let's move to our second, slightly simpler image. Again, we've linked our alt text in the upper right-hand corner of the screen now. So feel free to pause the video here to open and listen to our description. How did you describe image 2? We included background and foreground colors and a list of the symbols in each smaller square. We didn't make assumptions about the disabilities each symbol represents, since they can be somewhat versatile. Instead, we described what was in each image as objectively as possible. Maybe you also incorporated information about the positioning of the squares in a straight horizontal line, or a description of the sign language gesture for people who don't speak ASL. Finally, when formatting your alt text description, you'll want to choose accessible font sizes and styles, both of which we'll discuss in the next video. That does it for our tips on accessible imagery for advertising and promotion. We've also created the shorter checklist summary on screen and linked in the video description for you to refer back to as you make decisions about your affinity-related imagery. If you'd like to find out more or contribute to the conversation about accessibility, disability, and affinity programming, email WashU's CDI at diversityandinclusion@woostel.edu or send us a message on Facebook and Instagram at WUSTL CDI. Thank you for joining us.